Hello, hello. I'm so happy today to have Svanika Balasubramanian, the co-founder and CEO of RePurpose Global, join me. Svanika, I've just been doing a little bit of research and mostly this morning, and I'm blown away. I actually canceled a couple of meetings just because I just wanted to read more and more. Your website is so amazing. It gives so many details and the kind of stuff you're doing. I'm a fan already. So I'm so excited to have you, and thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
Of course, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the very, very warm welcome, Ved. And likewise, I'm a huge fan of everything that you're doing, both on the Good Garbage podcast as well as with Paka Inc. as well. Just so much amazing innovation happening in the space. So happy to get our hands dirty and dig in.
Super. So we have a mutual love for Oman. I've never actually been there, but I studied in a boarding school, and one of my closest friends was from Muscat, and he
Yeah.
would talk about, and he would just, I just, this is from when I was 13 years old, and he would talk about the Muscat skyline. And as he was
Mm.
flying into Muscat, what it would make him feel. And I still have it so etched in my memory. I am planning to visit there later this year, so I'm hopefully going to spend some time in Oman. But I want to learn from you more about your growing up years and how they impacted your life journey, and of course, the beautiful country of Oman as well.
There's so much to unpack over there. I think, so much of who we end up becoming has its roots in our childhoods, right? I think those small events end up playing a big role in our lives later on. But on the topic of, I think, Oman itself, I grew up in Oman pretty much all my life. I was born in Tamil Nadu in Coimbatore in India. And then when I was, I think, 3 years old, we moved to Oman, and I spent all my life there up until I finished high school, and then moved on to Penn. But it's an incredible country. Very suburban, feels quite, just everyone's really nice. There is very little crime, it feels very safe, and it is so in touch with its nature, which I think was one of my favorite parts about, growing up there. You could literally walk, I think, from the center of Oman, I mean, from the center of Muscat, the capital city, I think, in any direction for about like 5-10 minutes, and you can start seeing, the coastline start to appear, and so it's really like bordering that Arabian Sea, and then you have the desert, you have the beautiful, incredible mountains. There is such a rich connection to the landscape, which I think leaves a very profound impact. And I always, when I'm in a very bustling city, like I live in London right now, I do miss some of that, I think, connection with nature a little bit that Oman was able to provide, which is in some ways ironic because it's a desert. But I think, there is some part of us that will always just crave anything to do with just, nature, and in being out there. So yeah, I think you will have an incredible time there when you visit Ved, especially if you like anything to do with the ocean. Like, I don't know if you do snorkeling and then diving. I do think it's an underrated tourist gem in that regard, because everyone thinks of, the Maldives and in all of these other fancy places, for, finding whales and dolphins and some swimming with the turtles. But the Omani beaches are absolutely pristine, really beautiful.
Yeah, good to know. My oldest daughter and me are avid divers, so I did not think of that part, but because we were thinking more about Salalah and places like that. But it'll be nice to explore that. But tell me more about how growing up in this place impacted your thinking and your attachment to this idea of leaving the earth cleaner. How did that happen?
I think it's a really interesting question, because I think what growing up in multiple different places and then having this sort of confusion around my own identity. I think it never sort of like gave me the sort of directional focus on waste particularly. But what I do think it gave me was this sort of affinity to think about problems at a systemic level and find patterns across, like different regions where so many of the issues, and then this could be waste, this could be inequality, this could be sort of like any sort of discrimination. What we see in India, you can parallel that in Oman. You can, and then you sort of like find other parallels for that. Then I went on to live in the US for a bit, in Canada for a bit, in India for a bit again. And then you keep seeing common patterns. And I think, it really sort of gave me this global fluency that was really helpful in starting to think about some of the broader problems that we deal with on an everyday basis at a more macro level, where I think there's two ways to solve a problem. One is from the ground up, and other is from like the top down, where you're changing systems, and then the other is sort of like where you're grassroots and then building innovation. And I think I studied economics. I don't have like a very technical background in engineering. I can't invent the next amazing chemical recycling technology. So I don't think I was really necessarily cut out for the bottom up sort of thinking. But that both that, thinking about the world in economics and then thinking about the world as one connected unit, one interconnected space, really sort of like helped, come up with what we do at Repurpose right now, and then think about waste as a global problem that necessarily needed a global solution, and then accessibility for all sorts of innovations, a platform to come together. And then, I don't know, you probably like talk about this all the time, but one of the biggest problems with waste actually is the global trash economy, right? Where we have so many of our, quote unquote, the global north, the United States, Europe, like London, quite literally putting all of the waste that is hard to recycle on a ship and then sending it halfway across the world to places like India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and then now a huge rise in sort of like Somalia, Ethiopia, like a lot of African countries taking it up as well. And then we kind of come in and say, well, why is the global south contributing to ocean plastic so much? Why is so much of the waste just coming from the global south? And then it's sort of an unfair question, because a lot of it did not originate, where it actually leaked. And then there's that whole sort of like, interconnectedness that I think often is missed from the conversation. So yeah, I think there's so many different facets to this, but more so than anything else, I think, what that sort of global fluency helped was really think about this at that sort of macroscopic level, and then try to build a solution, build a platform that hopefully addresses it a little bit at that level as well.
Yeah, that's beautifully put, the interconnectivity. I want to talk a little more about your amazing family because you mentioned this in a couple of places, and the beautiful quote from your mother, where the possibility of failure should not stop you from trying. I think that's such a beautifully put idea. And then, of course, you talk about your grandparents being social people who are doing social activism and social work. So, would love to hear how that impacted your thinking, your mother, your parents, and your grandparents.
Yeah, I think I owe so much of, how I see the world, to how they helped me see the world. And I think I was really fortunate to have a family that was very, I think, in tune and they with impacts. I think they've always wanted to create impact themselves. They've always created impact themselves. And so even when I graduated and I said something crazy like, I don't, like I'm not gonna take up this investment banking job in New York. Instead, I'm gonna move to Asia's largest landfill, and then like do something with garbage. They weren't, they're shocked, of course, but I think they were quite open to the idea, quite welcoming of the possibility that this could be something good, that I could create. And so I do owe a lot to them. I think so. My grandparents, were born in Tamil Nadu, and then they were teachers, they were farmers. They were born into colonial India just at that brink of independence. And I think what they carried with them was really that spirit, which we saw in early post-independence India, of like really genuinely wanting to build a better country, you know. And I think maybe I feel like maybe some of that spirit is coming back right now with some of the younger generations, but maybe we lost it there for a little bit in between. But I do think in many ways, especially my grandfather, carried that spirit with him so elegantly, so gracefully, in everything that he did. And so he would say, you know, everyone's born into a world in crisis, right? Like whatever timeline, whatever, you know, age we were born in, there's something that is wrong with the world that we live in. And this has been true historically, like as long as humanity has been around. And so, you know, it's really our responsibility to step up and then do what we can to make it better. Because it's not like, you know, we've been dealt a bad hand. It's just this is the way it is. And then it's up to us to sort of do what we can in this sort of very one for all and all for one mentality, which I think again is very, you know, like reminiscent of that post India independence India, and that spirit of freedom and hope and excitement that was there. So they used to do a lot of work. I think they continue to do a lot of work on you know, literacy and gender discrimination and caste-based discrimination, and then, you know, everything from helping refugees. So Tamil Nadu had a big sort of pool of Sri Lankan you know, refugees that came in after the civil war in Sri Lanka as well. So a lot of different things that they did. It was never sort of like one thing, which was great because I think again it was all very, very inspiring, and I still look up to that every single day, as I was growing up. So when I had the opportunity to sort of say, well, what do I do with my career? I think I knew that perhaps, you know, again, I didn't know if there was a particular sort of that grassroots sort of way of doing things that I was particularly cut out for. But repurpose happened in a very serendipitous way, where my senior year, I was writing this economics thesis, like for this honors program that I was in, and it was on the topic of refugee resettlement in Western Germany. It was like a whole sort of different topic. But I was paired to be peer reviewers with my now co-founder, Peter Yamdal. He's a Chinese Norwegian guy, and he was writing about waste pickers and kabadiwalas and raddiwalas in Bombay, and specifically sort of like how there is, even within a very sort of exploited population, there is gender discrimination, and then sort of like, you know, the lives of female waste pickers and then waste workers. And I just thought it was such a fascinating topic. And then so, you know, one thing led to the other. We decided to co-write that paper together. And then my third co-founder, Aditya, came on board as well. And then we just found ourselves, you know, hopping from dump site to dump site, landfill to landfill, every little break that we got from school, which eventually I think, you know, led us to repurpose, and that's a whole other story. But we actually, funnily enough, stumbled into this environmental problem of waste and protecting our planet from a very socioeconomic lens, where we said, you know, because this environmental problem exists, it's led to this enormous humanitarian, you know, sort of crisis. And then so that pulled us in, and then now, you know, we sort of try to look at things in a very intersectional way. But yeah, that was a quick, I guess, hodgepodge of all of those things and then how they connected to where we are today.
Yeah, that's amazing. I can actually draw so many parallels to my family as well. My grandfather worked with Mother Teresa for about grandparents, actually, my grandmother and grandfather on my
Wow.
mother's side.
Hmm.
My grandfather was her right-hand man. Basically, everything that was admin and money went to my grandfather, and he has the funniest Mother Teresa stories. And of course, my grandmother worked for
Oh,
Home for
you
the
must
Dying,
tell us
and
one
when
now.
Tell us one now. That's a good one. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me think which one to tell. So, Mother Teresa, and I'm going to take over this. You are interviewing me now, so but I have to tell you one, and tell the listeners one. So Mother Teresa was really stingy with money. She believed that any money that came to her was for the poor. So she would never ever spend money on the sisters, which meant that where the sisters lived, plaster was peeling off. There were no fans. You can imagine the Calcutta oppressive
Mm,
heat. Not even fans,
mm,
because fans would take electricity. So she wouldn't even let people spend money on just putting up fans or painting it or whatever, Well, we take a life of suffering, and the money is for the
mm,
poor. And my grandfather would go
mm,
back to her mother, at least paint, at least let the sisters have a fan. They wouldn't even have a
mm.
pump to pump water up. The sisters had to get in a line and
Uh-huh.
pass buckets up the ladder, 2 floors. So she wouldn't allow that. She said, "That's not money. Is not for us. People are paying for the poor." But interestingly, what happened was mother didn't understand the idea of interest. So if there was
Mm.
money in the bank, she would monitor everything and she say, "Oh, we had this much. How come it's grown?" So my grandfather got this brilliant idea. He said, "Okay, mother, if we have 100,000 in the bank and it becomes 110,000, the 10,000 wasn't given by somebody for the poor. So that's God's money. So can I spend God's
Wow,
money
what
on the
an
sisters?"
economic,
And that's how it
spiritual
started.
loophole. I love it.
Yeah, it was crazy. And, there are many other stories, like the electricity bill would go up 30 rupees or something, and she would be all frantic, somebody stealing electricity from us. And that's whatever, less than 5 cents or whatever, 10 cents. And then, and then they had to work all the way to the chairman of the electricity board to sort that and stuff like that, like 30 rupees. So yeah, but many, many funny stories. But yeah, I could draw parallels from your experience of your grandparents. And again, they were born in that pre-independence and, grew up in the post-independence era. And my parents being similar as well. And you actually took up and answered the next bit of my question, but I'd like you to elaborate more on how Repurpose got formed with Peter, Aditya, and you. And Peter is again so well spoken. I saw his TED talk, and it was so beautiful the way he put his ideas across. So, how did that happen? Of course, I understand you've given a little bit of perspective, but you could have done many things, right? You mentioned that. So, tell me more about how these three young, brilliant minds come together to form something which is so purposeful.
Yeah, I think it was so much of, what happens, I feel, in this space is very serendipitous. I think you just sort of like stumble into things, honestly, and then it just feels right sometimes. But yeah, I don't think any of us, went into sort of college or went into sort of, like our internships thinking about waste, thinking about garbage, thinking about sort of like landfills. But that thesis that we did, that research paper, was incredibly serendipitous because it exposed us to this whole entire world that very, very few people see, unfortunately. And then so, we spoke with hundreds of people, hundreds and hundreds of people. And I think, we looked at the patterns again from Colombia, South America, to Africa, to Asia, and we started seeing those same things repeating again and again and again, where you had this shadow economy, right, of waste workers, these informal sector workers, a lot of corruption, a lot of exploitation within that space. But then you also sort of saw the magnitude of the waste problem in a much more sort of tangible way. And then so I think there are, two incidences that always stand out to me when I think back and then, say, why did we do this? Like, how did we get started on this journey? The first one was actually a very human, I think, sort of experience, where we were, this was in Bombay as well. And we were, doing this thing. It sounds very stalkerish right now when I say it, but what we would do for almost a month really is we would find a waste picker, just go on the streets and then find someone who is, taking plastic bottles or glass bottles or something like that. And then we would just like hang like maybe 100 meters behind and we will follow them. Because we just wanted to map out that entire sort of like informal sector, like, who did that person sell to? And then we would follow them and we'd see sort of like, which kabadi wala they sold that to. And then we'd follow the kabadi wala for a while to go see like, where their waste got sent up. And in that way, we sort of like were drawing in our heads and then sort of like, for the research as well, this visualizing what that entire ecosystem, what that market looked like, who were the players and whatnot. And one of the women that we, sort of came across when we were doing this in a very unstructured way, she was, not from Bombay. She was from somewhere else, but she'd come to Bombay. She was 85 years old, or like, definitely over 80 years old. And she'd come to Bombay and then become a waste picker because her family had kicked her out of their house, where she had sons, and then she had some fight with the daughter-in-laws, and so they kicked her out, and then she didn't have any means of like making money, so she'd found her way to Bombay, and she was picking waste, and one day an auto rickshaw came on the street because she was just on the street, and then she had an accident, like the rickshaw hit her, and she lost her leg, like one of her legs was quite severely injured, and when we met her, it hadn't healed because she hadn't received, proper medical attention for it, and was actually sort of refusing to get any further medical attention towards it. And then so she could barely walk, and then she was still trying to sort of like, pick waste. And the people around the stores, the little shops around her were sort of saying, like, yeah, we give her food when we can. She sort of like, comes in and we give her coffee or tea or something like that, but we don't think she'll survive much longer. She probably has like a few months left in her because she's homeless, she just has no way of like fending for herself. And it just broke our hearts because it just seemed like so wrong that someone had been so abandoned by society, who would have to sort of like just die on the streets because there was nowhere else for them to go. And we felt incredibly helpless at that point, didn't know what to do about it. And I think so much of what we built later was sort of keeping that in mind, right? Keeping that these are the sorts of, people and in communities that we want to make sure are, developed in an intersectional way with anything that we build at RePurpose, and then never to, feel that helpless again, and sort of like, being able to have someone go through that. But I think what that also sort of opened our eyes to is that when everything else fails, garbage is still almost sort of this place that anybody can turn to, however old you are, and then regardless of like how educated you are, regardless of like what your resume says and what it doesn't say and whatnot, there is some value in garbage. It's almost sort of this welcoming sector that you can turn to, and so if we can create the right circumstances around it, it could create a lot of economic opportunity as well, for a huge portion of our society. And then so that was, I think, like one thing that really sort of set us on this path. And the second, which was like, the final defining moment that we decided, okay, like let's finally go into this, is when we finished our thesis, actually. So we'd written this 200-page paper. I think it's more than that. It had all of these fancy statistical models and whatnot. And we realized that maybe 10 people would read it. Like, I don't think even my mom has read it to this day. And then so it's like maybe your professor reads it and then a few other people read it, but that's about it. But we were standing in Devnar, and we got this special permission to go into Devnar, near Chembur in Bombay. And then we could see this this enormous skyline, of just trash, right? Like these buildings and buildings of trash. The smell was overpowering. There were flies everywhere. There were dogs everywhere. You could see garbage rotting, and then fires in like these little pockets, and then you could see the Mumbai skyline in the distance. And then it was, that juxtaposition was quite surreal, actually, to think about how the growth of that city had caused the growth of this trash pile, and it was extremely proportional. And then so as our economy grew, our trash, our sort of this environmental, the social problem, was going to grow quite proportionally with that, unless we took some really, really urgent critical action. And so I think it just felt, at that point that, okay, we've done all of this work. It just feels wrong. We just can't leave this and then, not take the next step. And then so, yeah, and then we decided to build Repurpose around that, I think, initial sort of genesis of ideas and then thoughts that came from those landfills, from those dump sites.
Wow. And I was listening to some other recordings that you guys had, and there was a story of Bilal, and it was literally heartbreaking, how somebody can die on that pile, and it catches fire and you have no idea if you're going to have your friend there tomorrow or not. I'm sure that's part of the impact. I'm sure that's part of the things that impacted you guys. It was just like, for me it was jarring, somebody who's grown in that environment, and very similar to you, that's something that has motivated our journey. And we actually worked closely with the rack pickers at one point because we were trying to create a zero garbage township so that the garbage doesn't go to a landfill at all. And that didn't quite work out because you know the story. There's like mafia involvement and there's involvement of the city issues. And I'm sure you've gone through much more of that than we did. But something great came out of that, which is we started a school because most of these migrant workers, their kids were going and collecting garbage and not going to school. And the even better, interesting part that came out, the math skills in those kids were amazing. It was off the charts because at such a young age they had to collect and count and add and subtract and whatever else and calculate money, and they just had to do it. That was their way of survival, and it was just such an eye opener for us to see. So I'm sure, like you have a thousand stories from those experiences, but of course, you just didn't take that impact and do something small. You guys have clearly taken that and built something of real sort of impact and value. So I want to hear more about the work that Repurpose does. And I know that you've almost moved near 15 million 15 million kilograms of plastic recovery now. And so, how do you do it, and what is Repurpose doing, and how does the platform work? It will be great to hear your whole perspective on that, please.
Yeah, and I think it's actually a very nice extension to that story that we were talking about, anyway, because I'll pick off from where I ended. Um, because once we started, we actually moved to Mumbai. So after we finished our thesis, we just packed our bags, and we said we're gonna live here now. We don't know what we're gonna do, but we're gonna find something that will actually help, the circumstances, and then help sort of, do something good. And it's funny, Veda, you were mentioning education as well, because there was a point that we consider that too. So we first started with in what I think is very, very millennial thinking. We created an app, and then we said maybe we can do something like an Uber for trash, right? Like we'll sort of like get kabadiwalas and raddiwalas, and then we'll get them connected to where the waste is happening, and then they can come pick it up, and then that sort of a thing. Not a great idea for many reasons. And I think that didn't go well. But again, it was really, really good research for us to understand what was happening on the ground. And then for a while, we actually got into this whole education space, where we thought, maybe just where the adults are a little bit too far gone. Maybe we start with the kids, and then if we can, like help actually, get them to think about sustainability, design thinking, and all of that. that, there's something that we can do better. And then we used to work with, I don't know if you're familiar with Dharavi Rocks, this really cool organization in Dharavi, that does the music program. And then we did some work with them. But I think, we were always still looking for this broader, what can we do that actually helps? And eventually we came to this realization that we were probably not, we were coming at it from an outside in perspective, right? And it was maybe a little bit too privileged of us, and in some sense, to come in and say, hey, let me figure out an answer to these problems that you've been struggling with for like many, many decades now. And what we should have instead been doing is actually just sort of seeing all of the solutions that already existed and then figuring out how we could scale them up. And so I think that was sort of that fundamental idea where we realized that there were these amazing organizations all over the world protecting our planet from plastic. And then that could be everything from whale nurseries or fishermen pulling nets out of the ocean to more sort of infrastructural organizations building supply chains, building waste collection networks. And then we work with many in India, but also across the world as well. And then these were all amazing organizations. They could be for profit, they could be waste worker unions and cooperatives, they could be non-profits, but they had really sort of like, figured out what needed to be done in sort of like a microcosm in one village or two villages or like one city, that sort of a thing. And what they were really missing to scale that up, to actually reach more villages, to reach more cities and so on, was really just one ingredient, more or less, which is just money, which is just capital. And I think that in this in the capitalistic economy that we live in, where money goes, I think action goes there, right? Like if we have more money flowing into one space, we're automatically able to do more in that space. And so that was actually a really important understanding, because we were like, okay, well, now that we understand, as people who studied economics, as people who are sort of looking at this from that perspective, maybe that's something that we can solve for. And so that's when we kind of look to the idea of carbon and carbon credits. And I think carbon credits in their own right have been quite revolutionary in being able to unlock private sector funding for solutions that historically only the public sector had to work on, only the governments had to work on. And we were seeing sort of the same problem in waste, where you think, okay, my municipality needs to be doing this, the government needs to be doing this, but it's not really thought of as a private sector responsibility, although it very much should be. Because when we buy a product, right now the cost of the product only includes the birth and the manufacturing of that product, everything that it took to get it to you right now. But it doesn't really reflect what happened to that product afterwards. The end of life is not reflected in the cost, which is, I think, not the right way of pricing things, of sort of like doing business. And then so we said, well, can we get the private sector, can we get the brands, can we get the CPG, FMCG companies to actually, integrate end of life, solutions and end of life infrastructure into the cost of doing business. And then so thus was born a few different products. The first was the plastic credit as a financing instrument that allowed us to standardize, across many different sort of plastic removal activities, pull them all into one unified platform with the same level of auditing and documentation and standards, environmental and social sort of safeguards, all of these different things. And then we created the plastic neutral certification, which essentially, is 4 steps. A brand comes in, they measure their plastic footprint. That's step number 1, because I always believe that you can't change what you don't understand. And then step number 2, we help them reduce what is possible, sort of redesign and then, lightweight, that sort of a thing. And then step number 3 for the plastic that is going out there, let's say they're putting out 100 kgs of plastic, for example, every single year. They fund, the platform, and then we use that funding to go invest in these different solutions on the ground to remove 100 additional kgs of plastic from the environment that otherwise would have leaked into our oceans, that otherwise would have leaked into nature. And with that, they are then certified as being plastic neutral. And then we provide sort of these resources for them to tell that story to their consumers, to engage and educate their shoppers as well. And it works as this really nice sort of a bundled ecosystem. And all of the funding that's been able to come in has now allowed us to, as you're saying, remove over actually now 15 million kgs of plastic from nature. And we have projects that we run now in Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Ghana, Kenya, a pilot now in the United States, Indonesia, and of course all across India as well. And we do all sorts of things. I think it's everything from collection from landfills and oceans and rivers, but a lot of what we do is actually infrastructure building. So it's bringing that door-to-door waste management and collection supply chains and material recovery facilities and material collection facilities and so on for entire sort of villages and cities that previously have had access to no waste management prior whatsoever. And so that's really sort of how the model works together. So yeah, lots of different pieces, lots of different, I think, angles to think about it in. But we really just see ourselves as a accessibility platform, because I think it's just someone who is providing the right tools at the right sort of, with the right solutions to get brands to actually act on their plastic footprint.
It's very impressive. And considering the timeline and the scale and different places in the world, because each place has its own dynamics, what you've tackled is truly, truly remarkable. What I want to understand is, of course, one side is the brands who will fund and who will say that, okay, I want to generate this much plastic credit to be more neutral. And the other side is your collaborators, because you have collaborators who are maybe picking waste and then sorting waste and then trying to put it into a stream which is recyclable and things like that. So how do you identify these collaborators? Because that must take a lot of effort as well to find the right people and to make sure that it's happening in the right way. How painful is that, and how effective have you managed to make it?
Yeah, I am so proud of our impact team actually, because I do think we've been able to bring together some of the most brilliant minds in sort of understanding that waste management problem together. And then they do a great job of actually actioning this every single day. And then so we actually have a system for how we onboard an impact partner, an impact collaborator, as you say. And then it essentially first starts with what we call baselining, because no region is really necessarily the same. And a solution that, say, works in rural India won't work in urban India. And a solution in urban India might not work in urban Indonesia, right? So I think like each sort of specific region that we look at has, a different set of challenges, a different set of existing infrastructure. Maybe some places informal sector work exists, some place it doesn't, and then different levels of government support as well, and then so on. So we first say, okay, let's pick, the region, and that's determined by, the fragility of the ecosystem, how poor are the conditions for waste management in that particular area. And then so we pick the region, and then we do a baseline study to really understand what is actually missing in this particular location. And then the way, maybe one easy way to think about it is that any waste management supply chain anywhere in the world, actually, this could be New York or Nairobi or New Delhi, really anywhere in the world, it has three major components. So the first one is just collection. And collection is sort of, that could be collecting it from a landfill. It could be collecting it from door to door, households, from commercial centers, formal or informal, different ways. But the first step is always collecting that waste itself and bringing it to your facility. And then the second phase is actually segregation, and then sorting and segregation within a material recovery facility, and that is a critically important step that often gets ignored, because without that segregation, you really can't send it to that end destination. Because if you have a recycling center that recycles green PET and specializes in that, if you send them even a bag with like mixed colored PETs, you're going to send it back, or it's going to get landfilled, right? So I think that that segregation and sorting is such an important step. And then finally, you have the third step, which is the end destination itself, that end of life. And then that could be recycling, chemical, mechanical recycling, upcycling, downcycling, co-processing, all sorts of things that can happen to that material at the very end. And then so when we do the baseline study, what it actually helps show us is which of these steps is broken in this particular region and how exactly is it broken. And so in a lot of places like urban India, what we find is that step 2 and 3 exist actually. You have good MRFs, you have good material recovery facilities, you have good end destinations, there are recycling centers that are present, but what is really missing is that step 1 of collection. And even within collection, you might find different things that are missing, where in urban India, you have the high value plastics like your PET and your HDPE, the harder kind of like materials that are easier to recycle and therefore more profitable. They are collected, and that's what the informal sector does. That's what the rag pickers and the kabadi walas and so on do. But what is missing is collection for your flexible packaging, your MLPs and multi-laminates and that sort of a thing, because they're unprofitable. And so, you know, without sort of some sort of outside subsidy, they would never be picked up by the economics of like what already exists on the ground. And so all of this, you know, just to say that like depending on the region, you find which of those 3 stages, and within those stages, what exactly is bottlenecking over here? What exactly will move the needle the most? And then once we find that, and we call that additionality, right? Like where is the highest point of additionality? Once we find that, then we look for partners on the ground who have been able to tackle that particular piece, and then, you know, who've been proven to have a really good track record with sort of socioeconomic integrations and safeguards, good with documentation, good with sort of like verification and auditing and that sort of a thing as well. And so we then do sort of like almost sort of this RFP sort of thing where we look at, okay, who are all, you know, going to be able to do this? We select the best one. We do a little bit of a pilot with them just to see what that working relationship can be. And then, if all goes well, we bring them onto the platform, upskill them on a lot of things, like even, for instance, just using technology and digitizing all of their records so that we have complete tracking of exactly where a piece of plastic was picked up and where it ended up, and then who did it, and then that whole supply chain. And then even things like making sure that all of the workers, for instance, have Aadhaar cards, right, in India, and in documentation and those sorts of things. And so there's that initial onboarding thing that happens. And then, you know, they come on board and we're able to give them the financing, the sanitizing tools, all of these different things to actually then come in and bring their solution that actually opens up that bottleneck that we identified in the baseline. And then that's kind of how we scale essentially from there. And once we've done this for like, 5, 6 villages, then it almost becomes like a template that we can then take to sort of similar villages in that same locality, or similar cities, or similar townships, or, similar coastlines, depending on what the particular project is. And then we sort of then repeat that template again and again and again, until we reach the scales that we want to. So that's a very high level overview. I don't know if that was clear or if that was like too technical, but yeah.
No, very succinct, I think, very well put, and you clearly sequence things well. So it becomes much easier to understand. But of course, I totally understand. It's way more complex and complicated. And each step I could think about the complexities within that being in this space. But one of the complexities that I want to learn more from you about is the type of garbage. So typically, in an ideal scenario, my presumption is that the earlier it gets segregated, the better, which is ideally at home. But that doesn't really happen, especially in kind of places where you're operating. And then the other, so one is, where should segregation happen ideally? That's the first part of the question. The second is, what I'm told is there's a different ratio of wet to dry waste, and that creates its own complications. For example, in India, lots of energy plants were set up on municipal solid waste, and most of them, or almost all of them, flopped, mainly because of the wet to dry ratio, because there was so much more wet garbage in India compared to a Western country where there's more dry waste. So how do you tackle that, and how should, in an ideal scenario, segregation take place?
Yeah, I was just saying, you're absolutely right. The earlier in the process that the segregation happens, the better it is, and then the lower the loss rate, the lower the leakage rate across the entire process. And I think, it is hard. It is hard to get households to get segregating. Very coincidentally, I just was reading yesterday this case in India, in northern India. I don't know if you saw it. I forget the exact location, but one of the Safai Satis, one of the waste workers, came in and asked one of the households why they were not segregating between wet and dry waste. And then they got so upset they started threatening her with a gun. And it became a whole thing that the husband got really upset that the wife was asked to segregate the waste, brought a gun out, and there was a video of like them. So it is, I think, quite unfortunate that people are not more open and welcoming to the ideas of just dealing with their waste better, but also just respecting the workers. But the right solution always begins at the household level, because once you have something, I mean, even if we think about it practically, right? Like if you have a PET bottle, which is extremely highly recyclable, like a can, like a bottle of soda or something like that, but it's full of, I don't know, sambar, right? Like if it's full of curry, and you have to sort of like go send it to a recycler, they won't accept it because the machines won't take it in. The machines fail, and then you're not going to be able to actually recycle it. And then what you then need is for someone to wash it. You need a worker to be there to pick up that piece of plastic and then to clean it out, which makes that whole process extremely uneconomical, right? Because if you're going to increase labor costs by having to wash and clean all of the plastic that is coming in, then the expense for every kilogram of plastic or every pound of plastic that we are processing becomes that much more higher. And then so the ideal situation is always to separate between wet and dry. And dry waste at least can be sorted easier. If you're sorting, I mean, ideally, you want it even beyond that, right? I think like you want your cardboard separate, your glass separate, your sort of like, paper, and then that goes in with a different bucket, and then so on. But in the absence of that, I think wet and dry at the very least is so very, very important. But what we're actually interestingly seeing is that rural regions are actually more open to the idea of segregation, more sort of like, I think, open to a lot of these, we call them IEC camps that we run, like these education camps, to sort of like help households understand how to do this right. And it takes a while, but I think like, if it becomes sort of a whole communal effort, they all get into it. It becomes a little bit like a game. Everyone feels like, they're all, collectively working towards something nice. And then so we've had a lot of luck with these IEC programs in a lot of the rural areas that we work in. Urban centers tend to be a little bit more complicated, a little bit more difficult. But even then, I do think the education and awareness around this is growing steadily. And this is also where the governments and the local panchayats and the local municipalities can play a role to help as well. Because, it becomes sort of like if the local politician is endorsing this, and then sort of maybe giving some sort of like, small sort of incentives with the rations and those sorts of things. And there's more sort of reason to do it. Like we have certain programs where if people are not sort of like sorting right, and if they're not sort of, doing a lot of the things that they're supposed to be doing, the local panchayats might say, okay, you might not get access to your rations that week or something like that, right? Which is not, like it's not necessarily how they would do it, but it's just something sort of to like, motivate the people in open to learning. So I do think, like it is so important to have that segregation and sorting at that base level, and then to have these sorts of programs that slowly start sort of educating the people. The other good thing I will say, especially about India, is we've seen a lot of the newer communities, like these colonies that are coming up, that automatically set up, like even in the build phase, but also like when tenants start moving in, have two separate bins of wet waste and dry waste, and the colonies and then the housing society people, like they enforce it, right? We have some really really passionate people that we've seen, who are part of like a colony's green team or something like that, and then they try to enforce it, and then I think those sorts of things definitely help as well.
Yeah, and two more questions leading from that. One is you mentioned the flexible packaging, multi-layered films, which are, of course, so prevalent again. How do you deal with those? And the second part is wet waste. And, there's a lot of carbon capture and richness in that wet waste. Do you guys also deal with that? So those two, just throw some light on those, please.
Yeah. So on MLP, so in any plastic that we get in, and not all plastic is made equal. And then so we just call it all plastic, but really it's like slightly different materials when it comes down to it. And then so we have this hierarchy that we go down when it comes to that third stage of end of life, that end destination, where anything that can be recycled must get recycled. And then so if we're talking about sort of, and then it's typically mechanical recycling. So things like the harder plastics, PET, HEP, and so on. And then there's one more sort of layer where maybe it can't get recycled, but maybe it can get downcycled, where maybe something was food grade packaging before, but it's like no longer food grade, but you can make it into something else. Like maybe something was like a packet, but now maybe you can put it into shoes or toys, or like something else, like hangers, like those sorts of things, where the material doesn't need to have that same sort of like quality as it did one cycle prior. And then if it can't be downcycled, and then that's the area that MLPs get into, where you can't actually do much with them with machinery, and then that's because the name as it suggests is it's multi-layered, and then so it's many layers sort of like stuck together, and oftentimes they have this metallic coating inside as well. Like if we see a lot of chips packets and then biscuit wrappers and things like that, it's not just plastic, it's also like metal layers that are stuck to it, and then a machine doesn't know how to pull all of that apart. We're seeing now some advancements in chemical recycling, where we might be able to like bring them down to that molecular level and then do something with it. There's a pilot we're looking at for that, but chemical recycling is still incredibly expensive, and doesn't work at the same sort of scale that we would want to be looking at. So in those cases, we look at other sorts of end destinations, and then this can vary really depending on the local regions. So in some areas in India, for instance, we have the local government who purchase it and mix it in with tar and use it to lay roads, and then that reinforces the roads themselves, especially during monsoon season and that sort of a thing. We also I actually have a little show and tell. There's a podcast, so the audience can't see this, but maybe Ved, you can see this. This is a brick this actually used to be Kit Kat wrappers, and sort of like just like biscuit and chips packets and so on. But it's quite heavy. It's a real brick, and it can be used. This is from our project in Bogota in Colombia. And it can be used for building houses, for furniture, and it's actually low. It's cheaper than regular bricks that you would buy for construction. So it's good for building low-income housing as well, which we try to do in our project in Colombia. Like for the waste workers themselves who collect the plastic and bring it in, try to use it for building houses for them, because there is a lot of informal housing that exists in all parts of the world, I guess, in this industry. So there are those sorts of things that we can do, and then then we also do this thing called co-processing, where we are able to send it to cement manufacturing companies, and use it in the manufacturing of cement itself. And it again, has goes into that product. But really, that's where we draw the line. And then I think like that's the hierarchy that we follow, and that's where we sort of say, okay, this is the last acceptable end destination. What we don't do is actually any sort of incineration or pyrolysis, or sort of like any, of course, managed landfilling or open dumping or anything like that. But there is, I think, of course, one would argue that a managed landfill is still better than open dumping. Yes, there is still that hierarchy that exists over there. But I think in terms of the kind of projects we want to be funding, that's sort of the hierarchy that we exist in. Yeah, that was on that. And the other question you asked was on wet waste. Yeah. So wet
Yep.
waste, we do collect. So it depends on what the specific intervention is. So let's say if the specific intervention is working with a local sort of like waste worker, equipping them to become sort of a micro entrepreneur, collecting plastic from households, that sort of a thing, that we don't maybe collect wet waste in that instance. However, there's different models where we establish entire sort of supply chains, like where we are going door to door and collecting all of their waste, in which case wet waste is also sort of like brought in. So not all of our projects deal with wet waste, but some of them do. And we don't sort of directly quantify that. That's not the part of that supply chain that we document, but we still make sure that there is some level of like composting that happens over there as well. And then we have some really good partners that we, again, I think I'm a big believer in that. We don't possess all the knowledge. We don't know everything. We're not the brightest minds ever. And so it's always best to work with partners as much as possible. And so for that portion of the wet waste, again, we find, local partners who've been doing this, who know how to do it best. And then they take on that composting part of it.
I want to now switch to, you have these wonderful set of brands that are working with you, and it was so impressive to see the list that you've uh, gotten together. And I'm sure that takes a little bit of effort in terms of getting them on the bandwagon. And how do you go about doing that, and how have you approached them, and then how's that experience been?
I think, I really truly believe that brands, don't want to be the bad guys. I don't think, you have sort of the corporate world going out there. I mean, maybe some of them do, but I don't think the vast majority of them are, sitting and plotting about how to destroy the environment or how to, like have a negative externality, on the planet. But it's really, I think, the gap is one, they don't know how to do, like the right things, or like they don't have access to the right set of practical solutions. But also two, it doesn't, there's that incentive gap, right? Where it may be, historically we've thought of impact always as a cost item, something that is, again, something that's a responsibility of nonprofits or charities or CSR, and in that world of things. And then therefore a cost item is always something that a company is trying to reduce, by default, right? By intrinsic sort of nature of that. And so what we try to do, is reframe everything that we do not as a cost item, but rather as something that is an investment that can get you a return, that will be, that integrated into the growth of the business, that will help improve customer loyalty, that will help improve, brand equity, and so on. And then the data exists to actually prove that, where we are seeing this increasingly so with the younger generations, with the Gen Zs coming up, and so on, that people are willing to pay more for a sustainable product over sort of another product that isn't as sustainable. And it is very clear that, we actually just did some studies on this as well on our end, but also there's so many studies from Nielsen and McKinsey, and so on, that show that brands that do good actually grow faster. And in brands that have, claims that consumers empathize with and connect with, grow actually twice as fast as other brands. And so there is actually a case to be made of integrating, that dual, sort of priorities of purpose and impact with sort of the growth of the business itself. And so our role, as this sort of platform, is really creating the right solutions with the right sort of like really understanding what is actually practical for this company to do. How can this integrate, with their day-to-day operations and be seamless? If we think about, say, our measurement tools, our software for sort of like doing footprint accounting, or measuring the circularity score and things like that, how can we integrate it in a very seamless, practical way so that it's not like a huge lift for the company to switch gears, and it's just part of their daily operations? And then two, how do we do this in a way that it's not seen as a massive cost item, but actually seen as something that is ROI positive? And if we're able to make really the case for these two things and then design sort of a product and service ecosystem that takes these things into account, then I think that's where you get that sort of appetite from brands. And so that's exactly how we got started with a lot of our products and services. And then, you reach 150 brands. Those are your early adopters, who sort of, want to be on this mission with you. And then once you get to that early adopters, then you start seeing the network effect starting to happen, where, someone sees the label on a competitor's packaging, like that says plastic neutral, or plastic negative. Now they want it as well. Or consumers see it and they start asking their brands, why are you not, using these sorts of programs? And so we sort of see that snowball effect start to happen as well. And then, you want to take in those leads and you want to again showcase to them that this can be ROI positive, and then it starts sort of like going from there. And I think my really vision would be to get this to a place where it's really a default, where it's no longer, there are two kinds of things that people do, right? And then this might get a little bit too technical, but I would say there's one sort of initiative that you're doing for competitive differentiation. You're doing it because other people are not doing it, and it sets you apart. And then that's sort of like your first until you reach that sort of like, peak of that curve, adoption curve. And then once you're past that peak, you do it because everyone else is doing it, and you don't want to be left behind. And it's a little bit of a competitive leveling that needs to happen because you don't want to, like be the laggards. And so once we get to that place, then I think like, accounting for your plastic footprint as a cost of doing business, as sort of something that is really needed for good business growth in the future to survive for the next, few decades, that's really the place that we want to get to.
Yeah, and it clearly cracked the code on that because it's just beautiful to see not just like the brands presented there, and you've got a few great videos of the brands talking about their partnership with you. There are two more partnerships that you mentioned, and they warm my heart. So I have to mention these and have you talk about them. One is a quote where you say, "Empowering one's community was as is as important as empowering oneself," and that's beautiful, I think. And the other one you talk about is empathy as a quality in leadership in women. And those two are subjects that are close to my heart, definitely, and they're so important. So I want to talk. I want you to talk about your perspective of on empowering both women and communities.
Yeah, there are so many different pieces there, and we can spend hours. I love this topic. We can spend hours talking about it. But maybe I'll sort of like go with one, and then we can go from there. But I am a big believer in sort of a new wave of doing business, a new wave of like leadership, and then empowerment as well, where typically when we say think of a leader, right? Like when we say think of a good businessman or a good leader, we think of men, we think of these really almost sort of passionate, very strict, very disciplined sort of men. And then, if you think about someone who builds a very successful business, you think of people who were very cutthroat, right? Like who were very cunning, and then sort of like would do anything to get to where they are. And those are all seen as qualities to be celebrated. And if you think about things like empathy and kindness and thinking about those around you, and then looking out for those around you, and then maybe giving up in favor of someone else, and then creating that sort of a vibe that's almost seen as a negative. Like, I remember so many people in the beginning would sort of like tell me, you can't succeed if you're too nice, or if you can't be too kind, and want to run a business. That's like, you wouldn't be a good leader that way. And I think that's maybe not the right way to think about it, because that maybe might have worked in a different era, but we are moving into sort of a new age of doing business across so many different pieces. But even on this topic of leadership, I do think people respond to empathy. People do better. People are more productive in an empathetic environment, if they're really able to sort of bring their full selves to wherever they go. And vulnerability is no longer, I think, a weakness. I think vulnerability can be a massive strength, for leaders, yes, but I think really for sort of like communities, for all sorts of like contexts that we want to think about. So I do think that's a topic that's very close to my heart. But again, I'm still figuring things out as we go. So sort of seeing how to get better, how to sort of like think about this in more nuanced, more sort of thoughtful ways. But yeah, does that sort of answer? Is that the kind of question you were going for, Ved?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's important to throw light on these important aspects, and I'm so glad that you didn't believe them when they told you that you have to be, more cutthroat or something like that. And you clearly are an old soul, you know, in the number of years you've spent in this lifetime, the amount of thinking and the clarity of direction is really impressive. And that takes me to my second last question, and that's just the vision that Repurpose has is so beautifully put and clear. I'm going to actually rattle it out. 500 million kgs of waste, $1 billion in funding, 10,000 brands, 33,000 marginalized workers, and 500 projects. My gosh, that's so brilliant. It's literally giving me goosebumps as I'm mentioning those figures. And that too, achieve it by 2030, which is not that far off. So I want you to talk a little more about the world that you see and the way Repurpose is going to create that or contribute towards that world.
I do believe, systems change is exactly how we need to go about this. I think, we talk a lot about sort of like what will solve the plastic crisis, right? Like, what is that silver bullet solution? What is that sort of panacea that the world needs? And the reality is that there is no panacea. There is no silver bullet solution. And we need investment that goes into all sorts of different, tools in our toolbox, all sorts of different products and services to really get us to where we need to be. Um, I think by 2040, the amount of plastic leaking into the environment is set to triple. And all of the existing public and private commitments on plastic will only reduce that baseline number by 7%. So we are falling short at an incredible magnitude right now. And I think that's really because of two reasons. One, again, we keep looking for that perfect solution, and we don't want to move until we have that perfect solution. But I think that sort of relates to that second point of what I call perfection paralysis, of like, undervaluing progress because it's not perfect. And I think there's a huge amount of green hushing going on in the industry today, where because I can't be perfect, I'm not going to even try and call attention to the problem that I have right now. And so I think that the world that we're trying to build today is one where, and we talked about vulnerability a little bit in people, but I do think we need vulnerability in companies as well, for brands to sort of say, yes, we are not perfect, but we're really trying, and this is how we're making progress today. And then for that progress to happen, at a systems change level. So we are funding everything from reduction and reuse and closed loop systems to material alternatives, to sort of recycling infrastructure, and then truly creating a circular economy, and in doing that in a very, very intersectional way, because the plastic crisis created this humanitarian crisis, created this humanitarian catastrophe, in the shadow economies and the informal world that we see, and therefore it does, I think, have an obligation to also solve it, and so we wouldn't be really doing environmental justice right if we solve one without solving the other. And so yeah, that's a little bit of that world that we want to be building, and I do think it's quite possible. I think the numbers are, when we just look at it, like that, it might seem a bit daunting, but we're making very steady progress, and I do think that the consumers are waking up, people are really demanding change, and that's going to propel us forward.
Absolutely, and it will. I can assure you that, and you'll see those numbers change towards further up. And as we have clarity, and I've seen that happen. I talk from the voice of a little bit of a voice of experience, that once you have clarity that this is the direction you want to head, and I'm sure you've noticed that the whole universe starts collaborating in some way or the other, and things start happening, which is what we have seen, and I'm sure many others have. So that takes me to my final question for this interview. uh, what does good garbage mean to you?
What does good garbage mean? I should have seen this question coming. Let me think. I think good garbage can mean so many things, but I think, thinking about it as something that has value is where maybe my head goes to. If we want to maybe take this conversation a little bit and close the loop, circle back to what we were talking about in the beginning, about garbage actually being a very welcoming space, of having this value that takes in the disenfranchised, sort of like, the all sorts of people from the world can come in and participate in seeing good within garbage, and I think that's really sort of what I think about. And then so eventually, in a very ideal world, we get to a place where nothing is trash, where if it's good garbage, it means it still has value, and we're able to extract more and more value out of it, and then it doesn't sort of just get discarded. I think, and then we move away from this notion of anything even being garbage, I think, of being quote unquote useless. I think like that's essentially where we would have good garbage, I guess.
It's an absolutely beautiful perspective, this one of the whole trade of garbage workers being welcoming. That's a absolutely fresh perspective anybody's offered, and of course, this is a question I always ask in the end. Swanika, it's been such a joy to talk to you and to see the kind of work Peter, Aditya, and you are doing, and of course with your whole team. And like I just look forward to seeing that work take more and more life, and become bigger, and you achieving your targets and going further. We need more and more youngsters like you guys to come in and be in this space. So more power to you. Thank you for joining me for this conversation and giving your wonderful perspective.
Thank you. Thank you so much for everything that you've done, as well, Ved. I think it's definitely such an inspiration for us as well. I am so thankful to have had this conversation with you. Thank you.